Today, we do have the opportunity to learn from Dr. Ettie Zilber. Today, she's going to talk about the subject that we chose because there are a number of subjects that she can speak about. She is a Holocaust educator, an author, a lecturer, and today we chose a topic called As Mama Told Us, which is really to learn about her mother. The book that I'm holding in my hand is the book that she wrote. It's called A Holocaust Memoir of Love and Resilience, Mama's Survival from Lithuania to America. And it is a book that talks about being the first child after the horrors. This is on Ettie's side, born in a DP camp in Landsberg, Germany. She was very deeply impacted by her parents' experiences throughout her childhood, and encouraging her mother to record her story, researching all the memories. We were just talking earlier. Ettie said that even though she heard it from her mother, she wanted to make sure that for the book, everything was verified so no one could question it. So she researched it, and really talks about her journey in her footsteps and the impact that it had on her as a second generation um, family of someone who survived the Holocaust. So all of this is in the book. And today she's going to really present about the family story of suffering and survival. And we are very fortunate that in May, Etty is going to come back. Dr. Zilber is going to come back and talk about From Liberation and Loss to Love, Lemonade and Laughter. So that's going to be another presentation in May. But just a little bit about Dr. Zilber before we give her the floor. So she was born, as we mentioned, in a DP camp in Germany, which gave her a special responsibility. A retirement from career as an educator and a head of school in international schools in 6 countries has really given her the opportunity to fulfill that responsibility, which is to research and document her family's Holocaust experiences, reflect on that impact. And as she had mentioned, she really feels that presenting and teaching it and talking about it with others, but primarily the youth, and of course adults, but youth specifically, because we have a beautiful medium called the internet, which gives everyone an opportunity to read anything they want from any source they want, verified or not. So this really gives her the opportunity to share the truths, and firsthand or secondhand, where you know it's coming from a verified source. So thank you very much, Dr. Zilber, for your time today and your presentation. I'm very much looking forward to it. And just to make a mention, we are going to actually, today we're going to raffle off one of these books. I have a number of copies, and just for being here today, and we'll put it in the mail, so you don't have to swing by and pick it up. It will come straight to your home, but we'll do that at the end. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. A großen Dank. A großen Dank, toda rabba.
Nishtaf arvas.
Oh, sehr gut. Redst du gut Yiddish? Sehr good. Okay, well, thank you for the introduction. I appreciate it. And it's a pleasure to speak to your membership. I didn't realize you had members outside of Arizona, so I'm very pleased to hear that we have Woodstock, New York represented, because I grew up in Brooklyn and Long Island, New York, and I'm definitely familiar with Woodstock. And so thank you very much for being here. So I want to introduce you to Mama, and I've titled this presentation As Mama Told Us, because Mama did tell us, and not in her earlier years. And that's something you'll probably hear about many survivors who would never talk about the war and their experiences, particularly in the earlier years. And then there were survivors who talked about the war incessantly. They could not stop talking about the war. My parents were somewhere in between. They told us stories. English is my second language. I didn't learn English till I went to school. And so when my parents got together with their other grine cousines, the other greenhorns, most of their friends were also survivors. And what did they do when they got together? They drank a lot of vodka and told stories. And of course, I would listen, I would eavesdrop and hear all the stories. And so I got a lot of pictures in my head about what happened. So in the earlier years, my mother never, she never talked about it publicly. She did not want to give her testimony to the Spielberg Foundation. If you recall, there was a period of time where Steven Spielberg created an incredible database of oral testimonies. I think that he recorded 55,000 stories. My parents did not participate in that, but later on in her life, Mom was invited to the international school in Israel. Mom eventually immigrated. We all immigrated to Israel. We made Aliyah. And so she would come in and speak to the high school kids, middle school kids about her experiences. And so, well, Mom's not here any longer, sadly. So I tell the story for her. It was in her later years, we sat her down and we said, Mom, you have to record the story for us, because my father died young of cancer. And so we never really got his story. And we were determined to get her story. And so when her three daughters sit her down and say, you have to record your story, she agreed. And so everything I'm telling you is based on her recorded testimony, which is in the book verbatim, and including my research and my own analysis of things from a perspective of what I'm called the second generation. I was born after the war, or child of Holocaust survivors, as opposed to child survivor. You might know some of the younger survivors here in Arizona actually were born before the end of the war, so they're called child survivors. But I am a child of survivors, or second generation. So just to let you know, Mama's name was Zlata, and I'll tell you a little more about her family in a minute. So as a second generation, I've made some commitments. It's very important for me to be telling this story, and as the rabbi said, it is important to me to speak to the youth, because they don't know what you know. The adults, they know a lot more of what happened, but the kids are not learning this anywhere. This is ancient history as far as they're concerned. And that's a worry, because the ones who are talking about it are more of the deniers and the distorters, and that's a worry. So I started out with this project because I wanted to know all the details. My sisters wanted to know the details. And by that time, we also had kids, and we wanted our kids to know. Now, we have grandchildren. And so it was really important for us to document this for them. But certain things just take on a life of their own. And this grew into the book. For me, it's important, as I said, to speak to audiences and to teach about the Holocaust. By profession, I'm an educator, and I've worked in international schools in 6 countries. And eventually I was head of school in 4 countries. And in each school, I had students from hundreds of countries, and every one of them heard the story of the Holocaust. So that's always been important to me. For me, I consider it denying the deniers, denying the distorters. There are those who, it's hard to deny outright anymore. However, there is a new paradigm. It's the distortion of the Holocaust. It wasn't so bad. It wasn't so many people. Gas chambers, what gas chambers? So this is also a difficult thing to battle. And I'll tell you a little more about the specific battle that we have as we speak with the government of Lithuania. And I am, adding my little piece of sand, as they say, mi grano de arena, to all of the documentation. The Holocaust is one of the most documented events in human history, which is interesting considering there are still people who say it didn't happen. And it was documented by the Germans themselves as well, so that's pure anti-Semitism. Anybody who denies it, it is purely anti-Semitism. Now, I also go to different countries, and then I have those students in my schools from different countries. Particularly the ones that I focus on are the German students, the Lithuanian students, and it's important for me to let them know that I do not blame them. I do not believe that children are responsible for their parents or their ancestors' behavior. And when I went to Germany before the pandemic, I was invited to speak at 6 schools, and I could feel a sigh of relief when I said that, because they feel very, very responsible. Many of them feel very responsible. And of course, that's required education in Germany. Oh, and by the way, I'm a member of the board of the Phoenix Holocaust Association. And as we speak right now, we are in the process of getting a mandate, a bill through the legislature to mandate Holocaust education in all of the schools in Arizona. So we're still working on that, but it will happen. And we have a whole program. We've worked with the Department of Education. So just to let you know, if you have grandchildren or great-grandchildren here in Arizona schools, they will learn about the Holocaust. So I wrote all of this up in my book, as the rabbi showed you. And if you get a chance to read it, that's wonderful. And I would love to hear your thoughts about the book, anything in the book. Just a few weeks ago was Yom HaShoah. So all of us were very, very busy giving talks. Now that we have Zoom, I was giving talks in England and in Australia and all over the world. So, and I continue speaking in between from Yom HaShoah to Yom HaShoah. It's really important for me to teach, particularly the youth. You guys probably know this very, very well, but they don't even know what the Holocaust was. So I have to give them the actual definition. And so this is really the only place I talk about numbers. I don't usually harp on numbers and specific dates. My personal mission is to get the kids engaged in one story, a story of a family, because that's something they can identify with. They can't identify with the number 6 million. It's impossible. Even for us, it's impossible. And so it is very important to know the definition. And the definition includes the Nazi regime and its collaborators. And that played out very, very strongly in Lithuania. Lithuania had the highest percentage of Jewish deaths in all of Europe. 96% of the Jews of Lithuania were killed. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is the collaborators, the Lithuanian collaborators. And so that is something that I mention. And also that the Holocaust included other peoples, other groups, and you're familiar with those groups as well, the Roma, the Slavic people. But the one group that was targeted for who they were the Jews. And so this is news for the young kids, unfortunately. All right, no more numbers, but just if you're looking at 6 million, you look at the Arizona as a comparison. The entire state of Arizona is 7.5 million, and the Metro Phoenix area is 5 million. So 6 million is just in between. Just to refresh your memory, Lithuania is wedged right in here, this little triangular country, right on the Baltic. And the borders have changed since this map. This is a map of 1939, but you can see that Russia is on the border here and the Baltic Sea is on the other side, and they're wedged right in between with Poland. So we're going to see this is the complete country today. During that 39 map, the country was cut right off here. This side, Vilnius, belonged to Poland. And Kaunas, Kovno, which is where my family came from, that was the capital of Lithuania at that time. So here's my family. My grandfather, Yakov Santotsky, and he was a butcher in Kovno, and my grandmother, Etta. And as you can see, I was named Etta after my grandmother. And middle class, I would say. They had the butcher shop in their home. And my grandmother helped my grandfather in the shop. And one of the things that I and my family are really, really fortunate is to have photos. Most survivors have nothing, 0 photos of anybody in their family. This is so painful if you think about it. Can you imagine not having a single photo of your mother, your father, a child that you had? Nothing. We are very fortunate because we do have photos that we collected after the war. And if you look at this photo, it's all creased. And the reason it's creased is that it was hidden by my grandmother. She was quite a lady. She had the foresight to give a neighbor, a trusted neighbor, some of their family photos, and she asked her to hide them. And the neighbor did, and she hid them in a mattress, and the mattress in those days were made of straw. So after till my mother got back, it was probably 7 years later, this photo was in the mattress. And so it was completely wrinkled, and my mother had it sort of fixed up after the war. All right. My grandfather, he was a Lithuanian patriot, and he volunteered for military service in 1918. And these volunteers were called savanoris, and that means volunteer. And they volunteered to fight in the Lithuanian War of Independence. And so the story that my mother tells is very, very linked to these medals. So when I went to Lithuania, I was determined to find and buy these medals. So I contacted an antique dealer who had those medals, and I bought a medal from him. This is front view, back view. And of course, I can never know if it's my grandfather's medal, but we now have this medal at home, and that medal saved his life the first time around. This is the family, grandfather, grandmother, and this is my mother, Zlata. She was the oldest of 4 girls. The second daughter was Ida, the third was Nechama, and the little one was Genya. And you can see that this photo was also touched up by an artist. And this was another one of those photos that was hidden in the mattress. And in our home, as long as I remember myself, these photos were hanging on the wall. So people ask me, when did you first learn about the Holocaust? I go, well, it doesn't take much to learn about the Holocaust when your mother shows you these photos on the wall and say, well, she was killed in the war and he was killed in the war and this one was killed in the war. So I knew very early on about the Holocaust. And this was their house. I'm 99% positive that this was their house, because when I went back to Kovno for my mother had given me the address, but they changed some of the numbers on the houses. But based on her description, I was pretty sure that this was their house. The butcher shop was down here, and they lived upstairs. All right. Now, I'm telling you my mother's story from her testimony, but the story is similar, and I researched it afterwards about my father's family because they were also from Kovno. All right. This is my father, Lyova. Okay. There's another Lyova in the audience, right? Or Lev, that's his name. And his little sister, Rivka, she's still alive. And Feivel and Chaicha, my grandparents. And the family name was Sidra. All right. And so their story parallels my mother's story. And then, of course, at one point intersects as well. So this is a photo of my father on the back of a motorcycle. And I love this one because there aren't too many outdoor photos. And my father adored anything that had to do with mechanics and electronics. And that actually saved his life during the war as well. So Mom starts the story 80 years ago in Kovno. As you know from the history, Europe was divided through the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement between Stalin and Hitler. They said, we're going to be friends. You take the east side of Europe, we'll take the west side of Europe. We're going to be good friends. And so indeed, in 1940, first the Russians came into Kovno. And these are actual photos that I found of the Russian army coming into the streets of Kovno, Lithuania. And as you can see, they were only there for 1 year. 1 year only. Why? Because after a year, the Nazis changed their mind. They said, okay, we don't love you anymore. And they attacked the Soviet Union and occupied all of the countries that the Soviets were in. And that included Lithuania, and that included Kovno. But first, they deported many, tens and tens of thousands of Lithuanians to Siberia. And whether Jewish and non-Jewish, didn't matter. And anybody who was a leader, anybody who was against the communists, and anybody who was a business entrepreneur, because they nationalized all the property. So my grandfather and his family, my father's family, lost their factory. They were kicked out of their home. And they were actually on a list to go to Siberia, but I guess that didn't happen. But some other relatives were sent to Siberia. And that was just 1 year after they occupied. And that's when the Germans attacked. And so for my mother, basically the Holocaust itself began at this moment when the Germans attacked their city. And this is what Europe looked like after the Germans attacked Soviet Union and all the land. So basically, the Nazis took over almost the entire continent, plus Norway up here. That was a lot of land space. So Mom starts the story with the Holocaust on this particular night of the bombing. And she was coming home from a date. And the kids in the schools love to hear that story because they can identify with going out on a date at 16. And she came home and her mother said, all right, get in the house, pack a bag, we're leaving. And my mother's family tried to escape the city. They thought that maybe if they could escape to Russia, they would be safe. My father's family at this time did not try to escape because my grandmother wasn't very healthy, and she would not have been able to walk because they were all walking. She wouldn't have been able to make that trip. So they sheltered in place. And these are actual photos that were taken before the Nazis even occupied the city or the country and set up their Reich in the country. The Lithuanians had been prepared in advance to go out and pogrom and have conduct pogroms against the Jews. And thousands and thousands of Jews were murdered by the Lithuanians before the Germans even occupied the country. And these Lithuanians were active in what we know today as the Holocaust by bullets. If some of you might have seen the exhibit before the pandemic here in Phoenix, we brought that exhibit out to Phoenix. So these are actual photos of the Lithuanians who were armed. Everything was prepared for the moment that the Nazis would attack. And there are actual photos taken by the Nazis of the murder of Jews. I don't show these photos in my presentation, but you can definitely see them on Yad Vashem site, the Holocaust Memorial Museum site. They have excellent archives. Homes were ransacked, synagogues were destroyed. It was a true pogrom, and people were murdered. Meanwhile, all of the people who were trying to escape, including my mother's family, they were out on the road for more than a week. But they were stopped, they were arrested, and they were turned back to the city. And they were all taken to this place that was called the Seventh Fort. The city of Kaunas was encircled by 9 forts. During the Tsar's times, they built these forts for protection, to protect the city. And many of these forts became killing fields. That's where Jews were murdered. Not only from Lithuania, they actually brought Jews from France and from other countries to be murdered at these killing sites. And so this was the 7th fort, and my mother and her family were brought here and taken prisoner. The men were separated from the women and children, and the men were held outside. It was June and July, and it was hot, no water, no food, and they were lined up outside the fort. These are actual photos. And so all of these men were murdered. And my grandfather, I'm assuming, was here in the photo somewhere. The women, these are some more photos from the 7th fort. The women and the children were kept inside the fort in these barracks in the fort, and they watched as the men were being taken in groups, and they certainly heard all the killing and the shooting that was taking place right outside. And so clearly these photos I took these photos when I visited, and all of these green areas are pretty much killing fields. And the bones are still there. They have not been moved. So this is the 7th fort. Now you can imagine the story. My mother and her family thought that my grandfather was murdered that day. All right, this is an aerial view of the 7th fort. And so this entire green area is pretty much a Jewish cemetery. The information about the 7th fort actually appears in this book. Research was conducted by a Lithuanian non-Jew about what took place at the 7th fort. So this information is documented. All right. A lot of this information is also documented in the Holocaust by Bullets book, the 2 books, the Holocaust by Bullets and In Broad Daylight. And the one who is in charge of all of this research is a Jesuit priest named Patrick Dubois. And he came to Phoenix. Unfortunately, he couldn't speak because of the pandemic. So, but we had the exhibit. And he personally interviewed, his team interviewed non-Jewish eyewitnesses who saw the killing of the Jews. They witnessed it, and they saw exactly how it was done, and it's all documented in these books. The Germans had what they called the Einsatzgruppen. They were mobile killing units that were sent to different parts of Eastern Europe, because the Holocaust in Eastern Europe was very different from the Holocaust in Western Europe. Many people don't realize that. The Holocaust in Eastern Europe, most of the Jews were murdered right there in their town. They didn't go to a ghetto, they didn't go to a concentration camp, they didn't go on a death march. They were murdered by bullets. And so this includes, obviously, Lithuania. All right, and these are some of the eyewitnesses who told and described exactly how the killings were done. And these are from Lithuania. Right now, as we speak, there's a big battle going on in Lithuania, a battle about the truth, because the Lithuanians will not accept the truth that Lithuanians themselves were involved in the murder of the Jews. And these are two books that were written recently. This one just came out a few weeks ago, and this one last year, by Lithuanians. She's an American Lithuanian who researched and told the truth based on eyewitness testimonies of the Lithuanian participation, physical participation in the murder of the Jews of Lithuania. So it's heavy stuff, but it's documented now, and the Lithuanian government will not accept it. And they have made some of these killers into national heroes. Schools are named for them, streets are named for them, but they also killed Jews. This is a photo of the 7th Fort, the place that I showed you where my mother and her family were arrested and the men were murdered. Well, men were murdered, women were raped and then murdered. What do you see here? My goodness, it's a rock concert going on at the 7th Fort today. This site has been leased by an entrepreneur, and now they host rock concerts, weddings, not bar mitzvahs, and summer camps on that site that you just saw. So needless to say, this is this is too painful. This is a cemetery. Okay. From the 7th Fort, you're probably wondering what happened. And indeed, they released the women and children. They had to walk home. They walked home. My mother came back to her house. And a lot of the things were missing from the house, of course. But her neighbor in the back here, she took over and made sure that nobody looted their belongings, because most of the other homes were looted. And they came back and they figured that my grandfather was dead. And as it turned out, one day, my grandfather appeared in the doorway with 2 SS guards behind him. And he told them the story of how he survived the 7th Fort. He was lined up to be shot. They all had to get undressed. They had to dig the pits and line up to be executed. And before that, he had that medal in his pocket. He always carried the medal in his pocket. And he showed the medal to the Lithuanian who was going to shoot him. And the Lithuanian pulled him out of the lineup and sent him to the Gestapo jail. And in the Gestapo jail, he convinced them to let him work in the kitchen because he was a butcher. And so he had to go home to wash up because he was filthy. And so the SS escorted him home so he could wash. And he wasn't killed that day. So you can imagine the happiness that took place. But the happiness was short-lived, and they immediately started with the anti-Jewish laws, and you know, the yellow star, and everybody was forced to relocate to the ghetto by August 15th. Anybody caught on the outside would be shot. So they all had to move. And here are some actual photos of people moving into the ghetto. The ghetto was on the other side of the river in a very poor neighborhood that housed approximately 7,000 residents. 30,000 Jews came from the city to live in that area. It was a little bit tight. And these are photos of the move into the relocation into the ghetto. And I'll tell you a little bit more about where these photos came from. Now, in the meantime, when the Jews left their homes or when the Jews were murdered, there was a lot of looting going on and collecting all of their valuables. And this is a photo of an auction. He is auctioning off Jewish property. So life in the ghetto, basically the ghetto was one big prison. It was enclosed in barbed wire. It had armed guards at the gate. They were locked in, and there were these constant aktsias, decrees, and roundups. There was no food. The health and the hygiene situation was horrible. People were dying of hunger and disease. There were constant roll calls and selections. And there were all sorts of other activities going on, social activities, schools, and religious activities. So life in the ghetto, they tried to maintain some kind of Jewish life in the ghetto and tried to survive. And but people were dying, and it was a horrific experience, horrific. But luckily, my grandfather was working in the Gestapo kitchen, and that saved the family because he could bring home scraps of food. And they were in the ghetto for 3 full years, and that helped them survive while others were literally starving to death. All of this is documented in the photos that were taken by this man, Tzvi Kadushin, and he survived, and he buried his negatives in boxes. And when he came back to Kovno, he dug up his boxes, and most of his photos survived. And that's the proof of what was going on in the ghetto. And his photos serve as exhibits in many, many Holocaust museums, including the one in Washington, D.C. They had a big exhibit about the Kovno Ghetto. And here are some more photos, and you'll notice the Kovno Ghetto was a very, very poor ghetto. These houses were all made of wood, and that plays a role, and that's why I'm pointing it out. It was a very poor part of town. Many people didn't even have a place to live. So this is an artist's rendering of a family living outside. They had no home. And you can imagine in the Lithuanian winters living outside. Children were begging on the street or selling things. Here, this young boy is selling something to make some money. There was a clandestine school, but the Nazis found out about it and closed it up, so they couldn't possibly continue. They set up some soup kitchens in some way to try and help feed the starving. The ghetto was in 2 parts. There was a bridge between the large ghetto and the small ghetto. And the non-Jews would be able to use that road under the bridge, but the Jews couldn't use that road. And in the small ghetto, there was even a little clinic that they put together for contagious diseases. And there were doctors, there were nurses in the ghetto. And so they were helping. They didn't have much in the way of medicine, but they helped tend to the people. Until one day, the Germans locked the doors of the clinic, this little hospital, with the doctors and the nurses and the patients inside, and burned it down. And this is a famous artist's drawing of the burned clinic. people were constantly being shipped out to other ghettos or other labor camps. And this is a relocation to another labor camp in Estonia. People were taken out to work in work brigades because the Nazis, what they used the Jews for simply was slave labor. And they rented out the Jews, the Jewish slave labor, to many, many companies, many of which we know very, very well today. And that was the company would pay the Reich to use the labor, the Jewish labor. And so the Reich was making money off the backs of the Jews who were strong enough to work. Anyone who wasn't strong enough was sent to be killed. So this is the labor brigade to that airport I told you about. And my mother worked in this labor brigade. They walked about 10 miles to the airport, 10 miles back, and they worked at least 12 hours, hard labor, schlepping rocks and cement. There's another labor brigade that was taken out of the ghetto to work in the city. They were luckier because they could sometimes barter things for food as they were walking through the city. Later on, they established some workshops, and these workshops benefited the Reich, and the Jewish labor fueled these workshops. And so the Germans used it for their own use. Clothing, shoes, this is a shoe workshop, and also for military purposes. All right, until the big aktia, the big roundup or the big selection. And on that day in October, all the Jews were called out for lineup and roll call, and they had to stand with their families. And the commandant of the ghetto would select right, left, and those who were not deemed strong enough were sent to up the hill. And if you look at these drawings, you'll see people going up the hill here in this drawing as well. They're going up the hill. And what was up the hill? The 9th fort. And on that day, more than 9,000 Jews were sent up the hill, including my great-grandmother and many other cousins and uncles were sent up to the 9th fort to be shot. This drawing was by a famous artist, Esther Luria, and this drawing was done by my grandfather, Feivel, after the war from memory. This is the 9th fort. And in the 9th fort, they say that about 50,000 Jews were murdered up here in the 9th fort, not only from Lithuania, but also from other countries in Europe. This is the monument today up at the 9th fort, and this is an aerial view. This entire area, it was a killing field. And we know exactly what happened up there because my parents' very close friend was a prisoner up there. And what he had to do, nobody should ever, you can't even imagine what his job was. His job was to dig up the bodies after a few years and burn them on big bonfires to cover the evidence, because the Nazis realized the direction of the war is changing. So they tried to cover their crimes, but unsuccessfully. So he told us exactly what went on, and his testimony is recorded because he was one who escaped the 9th fort and survived. So this is another killing field during the Holocaust. Back in the ghetto, of course, there were many, many orphans, and so they set up a little orphanage, and many children were out on the street just fending for themselves, taking care of little siblings, as you can see. All of these photos were taken by George Kaddish. until the Kinderaktie. This was the day the Germans locked the ghetto, particularly when most of the people were out working. They locked the ghetto, they came in with trucks, and they took away every single child under the age of 12 and the old people and anybody who was sick. They threw them into trucks and they sent them to be killed. Now, during this time, it would sound a bit ironic, but people were, living and surviving and making a life for themselves. And that's where my mother and my father met and fell in love. And they decided to get married. Imagine that. Now, most people in the ghetto, they just lived together and didn't bother getting married. But my grandfather, he wanted a wedding. So he went and he brought the famous Rabbi Oshri to come to the house and marry my mother and father officially, kedat v'kadin, as they say. And so my parents got married in the ghetto, which is a very unique thing because, first of all, it was forbidden. If you were caught getting married, if you got pregnant, if you had a baby, it was all punishable by death. So they were taking a chance and they had their friends standing guard outside the house just in case anybody should come toward the house and see that there was a wedding going on. Not that there was much dancing or music, right? Anyway, so they got married. But it wasn't much long after they got married, and this is already now in July 1944. My father came to my mother and he said, listen, I have an opportunity to escape. He says that they're looking for mechanics to fix their trucks and their Jeeps because they were planning to retreat because the Soviets were coming. The Soviets were literally a week away. And so he said, I am going to volunteer to go out to the garage where they kept the Jeeps and the trucks. And from there, he says, I'm going to try to escape. And my mother said, Geh Gesundheit, komm nicht zurück, and let everybody know what happened here. And so they said goodbye, and my father went out of the ghetto. My mother didn't know if he would survive or not. And but meanwhile, back in the ghetto, they knew that the Russians are coming. And they figured, well, if we can hide out in the ghetto till the Russians come, I mean, they could literally hear the cannons and the guns, then we would be freed by the Russians. And so they had prepared these hideouts underground, up in attics, like you see here, down in a well. And they thought, they would hide out until the Russians came. But as you can see, this is what happened to the ghetto. The Nazis knew that there were thousands of Jews hiding, and they bombed and set fire to the entire ghetto. So anybody who was in any of those wooden houses was burned to death. And my mother lost her sister, one sister, in the liquidation of the ghetto. My mother was also hiding in a malina, but the smoke got so bad they had to get out, and they were arrested. And anybody who was left in the ghetto was sent to the trains, and they had to march to the train station, and they were all packed in. You know the story. And the men were taken all the way down to Germany, southern Germany, to Dachau. All right. So this is Dachau concentration camp. And these are students, German students, visiting the concentration camp on a tour. So I like to show that as because they do have Holocaust education. My two grandfathers were sent on that train down to Dachau, but they were sent to the labor camp called Kaufering. And in Kaufering, they lived in these little barracks underground, and they were helping. They were the slave laborers for one of the Messerschmitt projects. Hitler thought, he could still win the war if he could get this jet going. Thank goodness he couldn't. This is photos from the Allies. The Americans liberated Dachau and Kaufering, and they took a lot of photos. So they saw exactly what was going on in the camps. I won't show you the horrible photos, but they are available. Now, the women were taken to a different camp in Poland, right on the Baltic Sea. And this camp was Stutthof. And the women were brought in. They were given internal examinations. My mother describes it vividly in the book. They were given the striped uniform with the wooden clogs. And I'll tell you a little more about those wooden clogs. This is it. This is all they had. This was their uniform, and maybe if they were lucky, they had a little blanket. Now, in the concentration camps, there was an interesting phenomenon that took place amongst women. Women tended to group together in small groups of women. They called each other Lagerschwestern, camp sisters. And they took care of each other. They helped each other survive. And this is my mother. And this is the last time she saw her good friend Henny. And they kept each other alive. They were in a little group of 5, 6 women. And they literally kept each other alive during the camp time, during the death march. This is a friendship that lasted until their death. And there is no other friendship that you can compare to this. And so these were the Lagerschwestern. When I went to Stutthof, I got the registration forms for my mother, my grandmother, and the 2 younger sisters. And so I have those registration forms in my possession. And it even has my mother's signature and my grandmother's signature on it. Unfortunately, when they did the selection in Stutthof, the little sister was sent to be killed, on the line to be killed. And my grandmother, Ettie, would not let her go alone. So she switched from her line to be with the little sister. And they were both sent to Auschwitz, Birkenau. This is Birkenau, the famous gate. The train went right into the gate, right to the gas chambers. They got off the train, went right into the gas chambers, into the crematorium. And as I was told, the ashes were dumped in these little ponds. And that's how my grandmother and one of my aunts was murdered in Auschwitz. So I decided to go on a trip. My mother never, ever agreed to go back to Europe, not to Germany, not to Poland, and not to Lithuania. She went to Switzerland, she went to Italy, but never those countries. And my mother had passed away, and I decided that I had to go back and see the Lithuania and the camps. And I was more afraid of my mother than anything else. I thought she'll turn in her grave if she knew. So I decided to go, especially after I found this book. And this is a Polish researcher who describes exactly what happened in Stutthof concentration camp. But the most important thing I found in that book was this map. And this map shows all the towns along the death march. And I could never find the town that my mother said, where my mother said she was liberated from. She called it Chinov. But every town had 3 names: the Yiddish name, the local language name, and the German name. And I could never find Chinov on any map. But here, all of a sudden, I found the name of the town, Chinowie, in Polish. And that's when I decided to go and see Lithuania and also Poland. And I traveled along the route where my mother marched. And she said they slept in barns. And so I photographed every barn in Poland. And she said she slept in a church. And indeed, this church we found with murals to the evacuation. The Germans called it the evacuation. The Jews called it the death march. And it was indeed a death march. Most people didn't survive the death march. She remembers sleeping in a prison one night. And it was lovely because it was winter. And the winters in Poland, if you're not familiar, could get to 25 degrees below zero. And so they got to this prison, and she described it heavenly because it was heated. And so she remembers it vividly. But of course, when you're in that situation and your body is full of lice, in the cold, the lice are dormant. But as soon as you're warmed up, the lice become very active. And lice, those body lice, bring typhus and other diseases. Indeed, she did get typhus. And they continued from the prison town to the last stop, Chinovia, where they were in a barn. And hundreds of the women were sick with typhus, including my mother. And she barely survived. It was only thanks to her friend Henny that she survived the typhus. And one morning, somebody went out of the barn and saw that there were no more Germans. And a few hours later, the Russians came and told them, "You are liberated." And that's the moment that she was liberated. Of course, after liberation, nobody, drank champagne and celebrated. Most of them were almost dead. And that's the topic of my next talk when I speak to you, is from that moment of liberation until they made their new life after the war. This is a period of time that has been less recognized. Over the years, most of the information was about what took place during the war. And they didn't really focus as much attention on what happened to the survivors after the war. I mean, they didn't just go on to a normal life. The life was just indescribable after the war. And so if you hang around for my next presentation, I'll tell you more details. But this is an archive photo of the DP camp where my parents eventually got to this DP camp in Landsberg, Germany, near Munich. And this is one of my favorite photos of my parents, and that's why I chose it for the cover of the book. The two of them are standing lovingly together next to my father's Jeep. My mother called it his second wife. And that's where I was born. And so the story goes on, and all of the Jews were searching for a new home. Nobody, well, I shouldn't say nobody. The vast majority did not want to stay in Europe, the vast majority. And so they looked for other places. And since we had relatives all over the world, there were numerous options. And but eventually we decided to come to America. This is the ship we were on. And we even have photos on the ship. That's me and Mom on the ship coming to America. And the ship sailed right by the Statue of Liberty. And my mother said, "Oi, Gewalt, what now? No money, no language, no real occupation. What's going to happen to us?" But this is a challenge for refugees and immigrants everywhere in the world. And gratefully, they managed with many, many difficulties. You could say they became They were example of the American dream. They became middle class, comfortable, and mom lived till she was 90, and she died in Israel. And mom had her three daughters, of whom she was very, very proud. For a short time, we were all together in Israel, but my two sisters still live in Israel, and mom has grandchildren. She has 8 grandchildren, and you see that they're wearing their favorite T-shirt, Bobbe's grandkids, and they called her Deshene Bobbe. And great grandchildren. Unfortunately, mom didn't live to see. She saw the oldest one for a short time, and that's her legacy. She remained best friends with Henny until their deaths. And this little girl, my granddaughter, is named for Zlata. Her name is Zoe, and that's the story. So what I tell my groups, particularly the young, but I would encourage my adult audiences to listen to the message as well. Every single student I have ever had from any country in the world, I have always, always given them homework to interview their elders. If they have grandparents, great grandparents, that they should interview them, write down their stories, record them, because there will come a time where they will be gone and you will be sorry that you didn't get the story. Every kid, every human needs to know where they came from. And this has nothing to do with Jews. This is all my students from every religion, every nationality, and every language group. So I'm telling you guys, if you haven't told your stories, and you don't, not that you're survivors, everybody's got a story. And the story reflects the history and the period, the culture of that time. And every kid needs to know their family's story. So that's one message that's really, really important. And Mama's famous words, which I learned later in life, actually Nietzsche said it before her, what doesn't kill you makes you strong. And that's the resilience. Mom always taught us to be resilient. No matter what happens, you make the best of it and you move on. And that's the reason I entitled my other presentation, making lemonade. Mom always used to make lemonade no matter how many lemons she got. And finally, if any of you are familiar with this photo, this is a Nazi rally, a Hitler rally in Hamburg in 1938. It's a very, very famous photo because they encircled this one man who isn't heiling Hitler. Everybody else is heiling, and he is not. And the story behind him is that he was very much against the anti-Jewish laws and what the Nazis were doing to the Jews. He was a German, but he disagreed, and so he did not heil Hitler. And so I strongly believe that it is really important to be aware and active in safeguarding democracy. And one of the things that the kids don't realize is that Germany was a democracy. Hitler was elected into the parliament. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. I think it's important to speak up and speak out when there is hate and injustice. And Elie Wiesel has repeated that throughout his lifetime. Silence encourages the bad guys. Indifference, neutrality encourages the bad guys. You got to take sides. So thank you for listening. And I'm happy to take some a little more of your time. I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zilber. So the next one I just put in the chat, just so everyone knows, is on May 10th, and that's really the continuation and the perseverance after now understanding what her mother went through. You'll have that ability to learn more about the, like you said, the perseverance and how do you make the lemonade, sweet lemonade, I hope, out of lemons. So if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to unmute your mic, and Dr. Zilber can answer any questions you may have. And like I mentioned, I do have a book that we're going to raffle off. I put all the names of everyone that participated and put it on a website that's random name picker. So I'll do that after some people have questions. If we get, Lori, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. I know you're trying to get this law enacted in Arizona to teach the Holocaust. What levels would they be taught? Just high school or other levels?
No, actually, good question. The bill includes once in middle school and once in high school. So they don't dictate the number of hours in the bill. Every school district will probably decide that on their own. Mm-hmm. And so so that's a good start. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, perhaps your book will be part of that.
It will be, because I have offered to share my book and my presentations to any teacher who wants to invite me. And we are we're like an army of speakers. The Phoenix Holocaust Association has a speakers bureau. So teachers can book a speaker online. And well, if we didn't have a pandemic, we would come personally to speak to the kids. But now, you know, we do it on Zoom, and it's an opportunity. Now, clearly, while we still have survivors who can speak, you know, some of them are a little too old to be able to speak, but we still have some survivors who speak very, very well. And clearly they want to hear them first. But if not, then we have a whole cadre of second generation like myself. And we even have a third generation group starting of grandchildren of survivors who have also taken up the gauntlet to tell the story. So it's very exciting that we have so many active people in this particular subject.
That's terrific.
Thank you. Yeah. Are you a teacher?
No.
Steve, did you have a question?
Actually, a comment. First of all, thank you for an excellent presentation. I've had the opportunity to view a number of the similar presentations that the Arizona Jewish Historical Society puts on. So you must be aware of that.
Yes, we work closely together with them, and I've presented for them as well. And I'm very much involved in some of their committee work. So we collaborate a lot. So I'm glad that you
okay, well, I look forward to seeing you on their site as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Actually, they have plans now. We're working together of constructing a Holocaust museum on their site. And so they just presented the plans. We already have the plans and how it's going to be laid out. It's very exciting. And of course, now starts the fundraising, right?
That's the most exciting part, yeah.
That's the most exciting and the most difficult. So hopefully we can get this project off the ground.
Janet Lotman, did you have a question? Because I see you wrote in the chat, I just have a comment. You're a skillful presenter.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, this is many years of being a teacher.
Yes.
And then I have a comment, because I just noticed that Lil commented about someone, Janice.
Yeah,
and, Janice Freebound.
Yes, I know her very, very well.
Yes.
Good buddies.
Yes, yes. And
She's
she always said, my dad would never talk about his experience, and I guess it's pretty common. So
Well,
it's
yes, it
fortunate
is.
for you to have had some a connection with your mom's experience and stories.
Yes, listen, when we talk about survivors, it isn't a monolith. They didn't all have the same experience. They survived the Holocaust. That was the common denominator, but everyone survived differently with different context. And there's no, we don't rank who had it worse and who had it better. And, we don't do the Holocaust Olympics on this one. But there were those whose reaction was to completely keep silent about it. And like I said, there were those, I know a number of survivors, I know their children, all their lives, that's all they talked about around the dinner table. Everything was, Holocaust. So, you have these two extremes. But I think for the majority, they're somewhere in the middle. And yeah, and my sisters and I just sat her down and said, you got to talk, Ma, otherwise your grandchildren won't know what you went through. And when you tell a grandparent that it's for their grandchild, they'll never say no. See, that's also a phenomenon that survivors did not want to tell their children, but they were very willing to tell their grandchildren.
Interesting.
And, again, time passed, they were older. There are a lot of reasons for that. But the grandchildren often got more stories than the children got.
Thank you. And thank you again for this. This is, I'm again going to encourage everyone. If you haven't looked into the book, it's available on Amazon, but I'm going to do a quick raffle, if I can use that word, in a moment.